we bring Ed on the show, let's go around the set and introduce everyone. While we're doing that, why don't you in the audience reach out to a friend, ping them, and have them join us? We strive to make the digital download an interactive experience, and audience participation is highly encouraged. Right. So with that, introductions. Adam, would you kick us off, please?
Hello, everybody. I'm Adam Gray. I'm co-founder of DLA Ignite. And this really is the nicest way to round out the week for me on the longest running weekly business talk show on LinkedIn Live. And every time you say that, Rob, I just think it's amazing that we've been doing this for so long. So thank you.
It really is. Thanks for being here. Tim.
Yes, thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is Tim Hughes, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite. And I'm also famous for writing the book, Social Selling Techniques to Influence Buyers and Changemakers.
Excellent. Tracy.
Good morning, everybody. I am Tracy Borison, founder of TLBE Coaching and Events, a proud partner of DLA Ignite, where we care about marketing that works and just not doing marketing things. And I'm glad to be back. It's been a few weeks since I've been on the show, and it's always great to see your lovely faces.
It's good to have you back,
Tracy.
Yeah. Bertrand.
Hi, everyone. I am the newbie on that call. Based in France, and very proud DNA Ignite partner. I'm the founder and managing director of Odysseus & Co. And we work with customers to create more conversations.
Excellent. Thank you. And myself, I am Rob Durant, founder of Flywheel Results. We help startups scale. And I, too, am a proud DLA Ignite partner. As I said, this week on the Digital Download, we'll speak with Ed Thompson. With years of experience promoting neurodiversity in the workplace, Ed has worked with organizations to leverage talent that, wait for it, Adam, you'll recognize this, thinks differently. I had to borrow something from Apple.
Yeah, and it's right and proper that you should.
There we go. Let's bring Ed on. Ed, good morning and welcome.
Hi, Ed.
Ed, we've suddenly lost your audio.
I haven't changed anything.
Oh, we're
now
back.
We can hear you again.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank goodness.
Welcome, Ed.
Thank you.
Ed, let's start by having you tell us a little bit more about you, your background, and what led you to where you are today.
Yes, thank you. It started for me a long time ago, and I had a pretty serious car accident right at the beginning of my career and a major head injury. And at the time, I'd never heard of the word neurodiversity. And I was off work, wasn't back full time for about 5 years. Eventually, when I was, having done a bunch of consulting in the interim as I sort of tried to, make something of my nascent career, I found myself working for the CEO of a tech company in London with a mandate to sort of do the things that he wanted to happen, but nobody else had time for, which was, he'd obviously seen something in me, given that, I'd done quite well at university, although I'd obviously had this weird start to my career. And to my surprise, everything I got stuck into was about people. That wasn't what I'd done before, but that was what was keeping my boss up at night, particularly the idea of how do we build a 21st century workforce, and a sense that the team we had to some degree looked the same, thought the same, and wasn't quite it. So I got involved very much from a strategic boardroom perspective, sitting with the CEO in strategic diversity initiatives. How do we change that? And having had some success with that, having built some programs that actually went across the London tech sector, I started getting interested in neurodiversity at work because of my own experiences with a brain injury and because of neurodivergent family members. And that's the first time I heard the word. It happened to be a time where, and we're talking about 2016-ish, 2015, where some companies, a very small amount of companies, were starting what they called neurodiversity at work initiatives for the first time. And so Optimize was born because once I'd done all that stuff, I wanted to do more of it. Optimize was born with a sort of underlying mission to change the way the business world thinks about all of our brains.
Thank you for that. Ed, I want to start with a foundational question, if we could, please. I think I know what you mean by it, but I want to make sure that we're clear for the audience. What do you mean exactly by the term neurodiverse?
Thank you, and I think that's really important because there are lots of misrepresentations of this. Actually, there are graphics you can see out there that say neurodiversity, and then it says autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc., as if that's it, when that's not the case. Neurodiversity, in a sense, means what it sounds like it means. It means that humans have different brains. Everybody is wired differently. As one neurodivergent writer said, I think quite memorably, you can't go to, the British Museum or the Smithsonian and see the normal brain in a jar. Doesn't exist. So everybody's wired differently. And in practice, that means we all have different cognitive functioning around things like how we process information, our executive functions, things like how we plan, our memory, and how we experience the sensory world. So to bring that to the workplace, that means we're all different in how we like to communicate, how we like to learn, which I think is probably the best appreciated of these, how we like to problem solve, and the sort of work environment we enjoy. And you could put there where we like to work, how we like to manage our energy, and so on. Some people do have less common traits that can lead to a identity and or a diagnosis as neurodivergent. I think that's best described in the words of one of our advisors, Nick Walker, who's an author and educator in the neurodiversity space, as different from societal expectations of normal. And again, so why is that important in the workplace? Well, there are many stereotypes of neurodivergent people that are negative. But actually, if you look at what neurodivergent people say about themselves, more than half of neurodivergent people say they think they're particularly unusually creative. 44% say they have an unusual ability to focus for long periods. 40% say they have particularly good observation and attention to detail. 37% excellent math skills. So, they're not all saying I've got all of these things. But the point is, neurodivergence comes with what are known as flip side strengths. Neurodivergence is also represented about 1 in 5 people. And that means really not only is every organization neurodiverse, but any organization of any size typically has neurodivergent people too. The problem is they can often have particularly strong preferences that aren't being respected or adjusted for when you simply have norms that have emerged when we haven't talked about neurodiversity that work for some people, which is why they're norms, but they don't work for everybody. So to some degree, our premise is everybody benefits if we start recognizing that what works for us isn't necessarily what works for others.
So how do businesses kind of adapt for this? Because I love the work of Sir Ken Robinson, and he did famously some wonderful TED Talks about this. And he said about how the education system in all of the Western world was developed based on the needs of the Victorian and Industrial Revolution. Yeah. So, basically we need a manager that wears a top hat, and then we need a bunch of workers that have the following skill sets, because that's what the workplace needs. And for 100+ years, we've educated people in that image. And clearly the world is a very different place now. And certainly my experience of being in the workforce, I've seen people that have skills hammered into the wrong shaped hole, because that's the norm. It's easier to manage 100 people that act and look and behave the same than it is to manage 100 people that don't. So how as it becomes, I guess the diagnosis of, or the identification of neurodiversity becomes more commonplace, or the number of people who are neurodiverse becomes greater, and it's difficult to know which of those it is. Clearly, it's forming a bigger and bigger portion, both of the workforce in my company plus the people that we're selling to. So it's more important to take this into consideration when we make any decisions. So how are organizations realizing this in the real world?
Yeah, I can give you a few examples. I think we can all, even though this is quite a new topic, if you like, conversationally at work, it's not a new topic in the sense that humans are suddenly neurodiverse when they never were before, but we're just getting more understanding and awareness of it. And of course, why that's the case is another story. I think we can all, and I'm looking at all of you on the call. We've all can probably think of times when we've been at work where something's just clicked with somebody else, and somehow we've become sort of more than the sum of our parts working with them. But I think we can all think of times where the opposite has been the case too, and actually what should have been a strong team hasn't achieved what it might do, and there's been some confusion, some differences in how things are done that haven't necessarily been resolved. So how we think about it, I mean, think about a sort of team level. Any team is neurodiverse in the sense that team has different brains, but at the moment, most teams don't have any kind of awareness or sort of lexicon for that. So often that fact is primarily experienced as a negative. And we see that in teams all the time coming to us. Somebody discloses and says, I'm dyslexic, or I'm whatever, I've got this particular need. And there's confusion, concern, sometimes there's discrimination, there's disbelief, right to the granular level of even, we've done interviews with people in the workplace, not just neurodivergent people, who say, the way I like to do things just simply isn't appreciated or accommodated for. So that, you have missed opportunities there. I think at a fundamental level, learning what neurodiversity actually means, learning some of those axes of difference that I laid out, and then learning some tactics to share one's own preferences and to be more comfortable with other people having preferences different from one's own. That's the sort of foundation of embracing this in a team. And we've seen greater team synergy, team cohesion, and collaboration, when that's the case. You can obviously apply this to processes and policies too. We have plenty of evidence of neurodivergent people in particular being marginalized and disadvantaged by hiring processes that are shaped for neurotypical traits and skills. And so we've seen organization change those. A slightly more this is back to people, but I think an interesting one as well is a sort of attitudinal shift, that if we start to not just think, okay, let's embrace everybody because it's the right thing to do, but if we start leaning into this identity that actually we want to be a business where every type of brain can really thrive and contribute, and we can really sort of untap that diversity of thought, there is actually a shift that we're seeing and also propagating, which is amongst managers, where we encourage managers not simply to, as it were, manage the process. And kind of to your point, Adam, if all you're trying to do is just sort of get one thing done, and Steve was quite good at it, you sort of think to yourself, well, I want 50 more Steves. But actually 50 more Steves aren't necessarily going to come up with the idea to say, how do we make this process better? Or even still, maybe we need a new process. So there is a sort of attitudinal shift that goes with this awareness of different brains, and particularly the kind of creative power of that, both individually and collectively, where we would be in our work encouraging managers all the way through, right from their interviewing somebody, they ask people a question, and maybe somebody gets to the answer, but gets to the answer through a completely unexpected route. to see that as something to embrace, not as something to say, oh no, you didn't go through my steps, therefore, that's not going to work.
So I have a question about this, because as soon as you say that, then what I think becomes apparent to me anyway, is that we're trained that way in school. So then when we get to the work environment, we've already been like pre-trained that way. So from that perspective, like I'll share a personal story that I had a conversation with. So my son is 6, he's in grade 1. And I shared with his teacher when we started the year that I don't believe that there's one way to do anything. And so if you tell him there's one way to do something and he disagrees with you, I'm going to agree with him.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure she was super comfortable with that, but it was something that I needed her to know. But like, how do you see this as like, because I feel like it's a reprogramming. If we're learning it in school, then we get into the corporate workforce and it's a reprogramming. So like, what type of things go into that reprogramming?
I mean, it's a reprogramming of not just schooling, but I mean some of the fundamental things that I have a 2-year-old. So as he starts to understand the world better, I mean, what are the things you teach kids? You treat people like you'd like to be treated yourself. Well, that doesn't work if you're a manager, actually, because if you're a manager and I could go through on the axes I laid out with all of you. For example, how you like to communicate in different contexts, how you like to problem solve, how you like to learn, and so on. And I would get different answers regardless of any of you identify as neurodivergent. And that's the case in any team. So you're also kind of rewiring that. But I think this is good, and I think that's what we do. I don't think we shy away from that. This topic in the past has either just been ignored, and there's been a sense that most things sort of work for most people, and if the odd person it doesn't work for them, they'll put their hand up and tell us. Well, we know that doesn't work. I mean, most neurodivergent people won't tell you if things aren't working for them for obvious reasons. And then some of the attention to it has been, okay, well, it doesn't work for some people, so if we have an autistic person or we have an ADHD, what are all the things we need to do differently for them in order to not screw things up? And again, that first of all is difficult because everybody's different. There isn't a sort of one size fits all cheat sheet. But it's also not getting to the reality that we all have a different brain to start with. So we don't shy away from that. I think we very much see people as getting a new set of goggles on their team. They're not diagnostic goggles to say, oh, I think you're this and I think you're that. It's just an openness. It's building a kind of conversational scaffolding we've never had that doesn't require what we call sort of big D disclosure, but just in everything, whether it's onboarding, whether it's meetings, whether it's how we work remotely with each other. There is simply this base understanding of these differences and the axis that I described, and that really actually changes a team and gives people a lot to build on. What's nice is we as Optimize, and that's this is what we do, is help people embrace this. We find we don't need to be there the whole time. So a lot of the time, once, as we say in the UK, the penny drops and people start to see this and the goggles are on, if you like. They can often see themselves that maybe what they're doing in a bit of their hiring process probably isn't the best, and can start changing that.
I want to dig into the more inclusive workplace bit in a moment, but first I wanted to share a friend of the show and former guest, Jess Flack, shares with us, great conversation. At least 50% of the tech sector is fortified by neurodiverse staff, but only 30% of special educational needs young people by age 16 get a level 2 qualification in maths and English, as opposed to 70+% of the non-special educational needs public. And currently only maths and English are counted as functional skills. I'm campaigning for digital as the third functional skill. Digital can enable neurodiverse people to achieve more. Jess, thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you for checking in. It's great to hear from you again.
I saw a post on LinkedIn the other day. Someone had 200 applications for a job, and he didn't know how to filter that 200 applications down. So what he decided to do was the first filter was on spelling mistakes. So he basically filtered out anyone that had made a spelling mistake. And what he did was, because the role was for an American role, anybody that used S's rather than Z's were basically filtered out. And one of the responses on the LinkedIn post pointed out that he'd made a spelling mistake in his post, and therefore, what was his expectation? Should she just scroll on, or? And then there was a discussion about the fact that that neurodiversity means that some people may make spelling mistakes.
Or that your phone autocorrects a word to something that you didn't mean it to say.
Yeah.
But I think it points out a really interesting way. I mean, one, it shows a way that I think is common, right? So I think this is something that is trained. We think people who have perfect spelling are good and people who don't have perfect spelling are bad. And it's an opportunity to open that conversation to say, like, I'm pretty sure Tim has pointed out spelling mistakes on my posts and I've fixed them, right? Like, and then are we taking that to the additional level of discriminating against that, right? Because in that example, and now we're discriminating against the spelling mistake. And is that actually what we meant to do? Or did we do it because of ease of use, but we didn't really think about the ramifications of that?
Yeah. I want to jump in here. Thank you both. And it's really interesting. I should say, first of all, that one of our main script writers at Optimize is dyslexic and, by her own estimation, not very good at spelling. So that's just something that I think a lot of organizations would say, oh, we need someone to write a script and therefore perfect spelling is essential. Well, we actually see in her everything she brings to the scripts, and we deal with the spelling part. And I think that's a microcosm of, again, maybe a sort of attitudinal shift here. Back to Adam's point, I think the sort of industrial revolution kind of Taylorian approach to work, coupled with the far slower pace of change in, say, the 20th century compared to the 21st, meant that organizations were attracted to generalists. And to some degree, it's kind of like it is following that school model. It's about sort of being quite good at everything. It's about not letting yourself down in any particular area. And to some degree, why not? If you've got the lifespan of companies is 60 years, to some degree, you don't want anybody to come and rock the boat. You just need somebody to come in and sort of do their little piece, and that's fine. But the 21st century is totally different. The lifespan of companies is, I think, under 15 years now and plummeting. I think we need to start leaning into the best human skills we can find, much more like a sports team leans into the best athletic traits. You don't have a sports team where everyone's sort of quite good at this and quite good at that. I mean, that doesn't work. You really try to take the best and blend. And we get to the idea of the spiky profile, which, in case some of your listeners and viewers aren't aware of, just to kind of lay that out quickly. If we were to take sort of 8 to 10 generic work skills that would be useful in most sort of knowledge work. Now, that could be verbal communication, written communication, it could be creativity, it could be personal organization, it could be prioritization, things that are going to be useful to some degree for everybody. The generalist and potentially a neurotypical might be 6 7s across the board. A neurodivergent person might be a 10 in creativity. And I talked to somebody from my book who said that he thinks he has 80 to 100 ideas for every one idea one of his colleagues has. And there was no boast there. but that same person might be a 3 in personal organization. They might be a 2 in written communication. So again, it's a sort of, there is that, to your point, there is a sort of mindset shift here. You know, is that what we want? I would argue that is what we want, but we have to start believing that.
Well, Ed, thank you so much for raising this topic. I've got 3 kids, one of which has a very severe dyslexia, and it's been an absolute nightmare from school to even work. And yes, he is dictating to his phone the messages that he's sending to me, so that it actually comes in a way that I can read them. Because prior to that, I had to read them but loud to really understand what he was trying to tell me. And my experience is that the reality is that, at least in our country, is that there is, it ends up with building communities. So you will never hire someone different if you're not different yourself. And that's a missed opportunity. I fully agree. But then the question is really, how do we break these walls? And because there's a bit of fear into this, there's the fear of the unknown. Well, we don't know these guys. We don't know how they behave. We don't understand this, so therefore it's scary. So we'd better let them between them instead of trying to understand. And I'm really curious about the methodology or the way you approach this with people who don't believe in this. So how do you really action, making them consider things slightly differently, and therefore, maybe reassure them on the fact that, it's not that scary indeed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's interesting. I don't think we've ever worked with an organization that wasn't embracing this, for the first time. And of course, you get very, very different foundational perspectives from folks who we work with. There's people who are neurodivergent themselves and never told anyone, to think, thank God this is happening. That's great, including leaders. And I've written recently about how many leaders are neurodivergent, but often, they've had to mask to get where they are. But then, of course, to your point, you have people who say, well, what's this got to do with me? I don't have any, autistic people in my team. This sounds like a waste of time. So I think it's building the awareness in a way that really resonates with people, which we try to do. Again, this is not about what happens if you have somebody who puts their hand up. This is giving everybody tools and tactics to work with whoever's next to them. And I think people start to understand neurodiversity when we start to dig into things like problem solving, and they realize that actually, regardless of whether they think their team is all the same as them, they're not. So I think that's where they start getting a sense of what this means to them. And this isn't, if you like, a diversity topic that is simply about including a marginalized group. It is, but it's also much more about all of us. But then, what happens while we do this, and what has been a truism of all the work we've done, is that in organizations that start to bring this in, more people start disclosing, more people start talking about it. And suddenly you realize this idea you had of, oh, we don't have anybody like that here, is nonsense. And you have this conversation fueled with the lexicon and the kind of the tactics and the sensitivity that we've primed people with, where it's not necessarily everybody says, oh, I'm dyspraxic, or, but you have a far more openness and conversation about different ways of doing things. And including, just to your point there about, again, back to the point about leaders, including amongst leaders. Amazing how many organizations we've worked with, and as it were, the COO says, actually, I'm dyslexic myself, and this is really important to me, and I want to make this my big focus topic for 2025. And suddenly the manager who said, what's this got to do with me, feels a little different.
We have some fantastic comments from the audience. I want to bring some of them in. Julia Harris shares with us, Understanding the overlapping traits of neurodivergence helps us understand barriers and the mental health impacts of barriers on all humans. Amen to that, Julia. And we have Tanya Haig Coburn sharing, having a background in psychology with a past as being a teacher and now a leader, it's so important to recognize how widely neurodivergence is in the workplace, whether identified or not. So many of my female peers are now being diagnosed in their 40s with ADHD, which has been life-changing for them. The one-size-fits-all strategy in the workplace is antiquated and, quite frankly, needs to be overhauled. Thank you, Tanya. We have a number of other comments. Please keep them coming, and we will share them throughout. But I want to bring it back to Ed for a moment. Ed, I wanted to ask you, what are some misconceptions about neurodiversity in the workplace that prevent businesses from embracing it?
Gosh, there's a lot. And I've written articles about this that I'm going to try and remember all my various points now. I mean, I think one we just talked about, the idea, as it were, we don't have anybody like that here. I mean, that's not only misses the fact that every team is neurodiverse, it also just misses the fact that that means that then we're not all the same as each other, and also misses the fact that, again, in any organization of size, you're going to have neurodivergent people as well. Another one, I think, is the idea of the sort of, I call it the misconception of the neutral starting point. So I think businesses learn about something they hadn't been thinking of, and they sort of consider where they are is sort of neutral. Okay, well, we could be worse, we could be better. But actually, in any organization that isn't embracing this, and there isn't a positive conversation around it, and there aren't accessible accommodations, and there isn't an inclusive hiring processes, and there aren't transparent policies, and there aren't managers who appreciate that how people like to get instructions isn't necessarily how they like to give them, there is a negative starting point. Most people don't know what neurodiversity is, and most neurodivergent people at work, or many neurodivergent people at work, are struggling because of it. I think there's also the misconception that there is a sort of cheat sheet per, if you like, neurotype. So, okay, what do I do if I have someone who's autistic? What do I do if I have someone who's dyslexic? And and so on. But ultimately, that's nonsense. And we've interviewed so many people in the community as part of our focus groups, and to some degree, everybody bucks the stereotype in some way, right? Rather than confirming them. So that's another misconception I think is quite important, and actually relates to the comment you just had, Rob, about some of the, if you like, crossover amongst people who are neurodivergent. There's been a great movement the last few years of people who are both autistic and ADHDers sharing their experiences and traits. Of course, they're not all the same either, but there's some particular combinations of traits there. I think it's also important here to appreciate that neurodivergence, if you like, cuts across every other demographic line as well. And being neurodivergent and being a Black woman, given barriers in the workplace faced by minority demographics, can be more complicated, or certainly very different from being neurodivergent and a white man.
So you said, Ed, at the beginning that neurodiversity is not a series of, and I'll paraphrase, not a series of buckets. It's a spectrum, and there are loads of people who are in loads of different
Yeah,
pools.
it's a galaxy, if you like.
Yeah. So and also that the norm potentially isn't actually even the norm. So I'm average at everything. That makes me average rather than the norm, because there may be nobody else like me. And I'm not saying that I am average or don't have any neurodiversity or anything.
It's also contextual. Sorry, Adam, but it's also very contextual. The idea of sort of neurotypical is contextual. If you work in a team of neurodivergent coders, for example, not to sort of reinforce that stereotype, and you have a very different thinking style, you are not neurotypical of that group.
Absolutely. So I guess that my question is, I kind of like the guy that's looking for directions, and he pulls up and he winds the window down and he says to somebody, "Can you tell me how to get to Main Street?" And the person says, "Well, I wouldn't start from here if I were you." You know, so we're in a situation where there's a huge amount of baggage attached to all of this.
Yeah.
And a whole load of preconceptions, and part of that, you know, you gave if you like, a definition or a description of what neurodiversity is at the beginning, and I'm sure that for many people that consume this content, that will be a good starting point in understanding this. But do we run the risk of marginalizing people by putting them into these different categories, rather than by saying, okay, I'm really good at this, but I'm really bad at that, and that's actually part of my strengths. So, you know, some people used to revise for university with music playing. I never could. I needed quiet in order to be able to consume stuff and be able, and I still do. Now, that may mean that I have some degree of neurodiversity there, or it may mean that I just need quiet to do stuff. And is it not more a case of identifying people's strengths and weaknesses in the way that they work and saying, actually, you're really good at doing this. You're really good at sitting in the middle of the office and directing traffic. I'm really bad at that. I need to sit on the outside of the office in a quiet room and do stuff. And I know that when Tim and I worked in a big corporate, although as a corporate, it was not particularly well known for embracing different styles, what it did do is I think it recognized that lots of people needed to do stuff in different ways. So some people worked in a hot desking environment, some people worked in quiet rooms, some people worked in pods, some people worked in the coffee shop, and that's how they worked best. And although that wasn't given any kind of specific labeling or type, you were allowed to experiment with all of these different areas and see what worked for you. And is that a better goal to aim for than saying, okay, well, we've got all of these different types? And it's a question, not a leading question, because I genuinely don't know.
I think that absolutely is, but I also would say I don't think, and I hope it hasn't come across that. I would say everything I've said has been to say we don't approach it by saying we've got all these different types.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's more about my ignorance than about what you said.
Yeah, so I think the point of embracing neurodiversity is to go back to the beginning, to remember that this means that we all do things differently, right? And actually that's where this idea and the phrase I use, the kind of conversational scaffolding around differences, which isn't around, oh, Adam, are you autistic or whatever, or oh, Ed, are you an ADHD? It's around being open and recognizing the fact that we do have these preferences around where we work, how we work, and so on. I mean, I think that's fundamental to embracing neurodiversity at work and normalizing differences that have previously been marginalized, stigmatized, you know, and stereotyped. So I think what you're describing is absolutely what I think is kind of a big part of this approach. And I think what you're describing there with the organization you worked at can be sort of, you know, elevated. So it's not just sort of, well, we sort of have a underlying sense that we're not all the same, but you know, we can actually start celebrating that, and we can start having norms in, say, meetings or so that actually recognize that, and that aren't about diagnostic labels, but are really putting that into practice, or different career paths for different, you know. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right. And I think actually that's what typically neurodivergent people want. We do have a situation, of course, which is where we are as humanity, as we get our head around this idea of brain differences, that some neurotypes have been medicalized and have the both sort of identity power of that these are terms that never existed. Nobody appreciated that the dyslexic style even existed. I mean, that's a good thing, but it's come with the negative language and the fact that diagnostic processes are all based on negatives. And look at the terms ADHD and dyslexia, and so on. But these have been repurposed now as identity labels. And so, somebody who is neurodivergent often feels that's an absolutely fundamental part of their identity, in the same way that, maybe being gay is, or being British, or, or whatever. So I think what we want to do, Adam, to your point, is to create this space where we all appreciate that we're all different and have the tools to do that, but also a space that accepts and understands that some people are going to want to share some of those elements of their identity as well. And they're going to want to share those not under pressure because everybody's screaming at them for being so slow with the spreadsheet, but in a way that anybody might want to share any aspects of their identity in order to feel that they're bringing their full self to work. So I think we're on the same page as how we think about it.
I want to bring in some additional audience comments. Leif Sorensen shares, we recently designed an online game with a unique approach by integrating a neurodivergent perspective into every decision-making option. He goes on to say, the feedback has been inspiring. Players are coming away with not just knowledge, but a deeper appreciation for the strengths and perspectives of neurodivergent individuals bring to the table. And Carol Jean Whittington says, it all goes back to what we value as an organization and as a society. Again, thank you all for the comments, and please keep them coming. Tracy,
yeah,
I think you had
I'd
something
actually like to touch on, there's a comment from Julia too, saying labeling typical and divergent is required currently to help identify and discuss very evident inequitable outcomes in the way society is currently set up. And I think this is an interesting point, because I think a lot of time, and specifically we're talking about this today from a business perspective and how we discuss neuroinclusion in the workplace. But Carol Jean is a very dear friend of mine, and I've heard her speak very often about the level of masking that happens in the neurodivergent community, which then leads to burnout in multiple areas, but also leads to a misunderstanding of how those people could be beneficial in a work scenario. So if you're a 10 in creativity, but you're hiding the fact that you're a 10 to try and be a 6, because that is what is quote unquote acceptable here, then we don't really have the exposure to your gifts in order to even have the conversation about how to use them. And so in the neuroinclusion conversation, Ed, how much of this is like a personal comfort, or even maybe self-awareness is the beginning point of being able to bring your full gifts to the table because they do have value?
There is a bit of meeting in the middle, and something we do with our platform, the Upskill platform, we provide sessions and guidance for neurodivergent employees. And of course, it's very opt-in because we recognize no two people are alike. So we don't say, oh, you're autistic, you need social skills training. That wouldn't work. But we offer things that people have found helpful. They're all, guided by our neurodivergent facilitators. And something we did recently was around what we call finding your niche, which is actually, if you're going to get into sort of strategic advocacy as a neurodivergent person of who you are, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, to some degree, you have to learn that first. And I remember, going into the workplace, going into my first meetings, I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody tells you how it works. And of course, your context shifts. Suddenly you have an understanding manager, or suddenly you don't, or, you move job, you move team. So I think there should be in a sense, and this is kind of to Adam's point about, where we want to sort of get to. I think we should all be going on that journey of trying to understand our own brain and what that means for our work preferences, and evolving that sort of self-advocacy tool set as we go in our career. And it was interesting. We're working with one of the biggest companies in the world at the moment about leadership and developing more neurodivergent leaders. And actually what we found is they have lots of neurodivergent leaders already. And the neurodivergent leaders that they have absolutely embody leaning into the spiky profile. They're not people who've tried to pretend to be good at the things they're not good at. What they've done is they've been very, very good at advocating for themselves and their strengths and what those strengths can mean in their business around those peaks. You know, I'm really good at these things and our customers appreciate that. And they've learned also to get help and to advocate for that help in the areas where, you know, they're not so strong. But I think that's a career-long evolution for all of us. And, you know, I'm the same. I had a traumatic brain injury. I have a sensitivity to lights. My wife sort of is used to me. We sit down in a restaurant and I say, I can't sit here. I need to sit over there. Actually, let me sit over there because, you know, there's a candle or a spotlight on my head. And I know I'm not going to enjoy the meal. But nobody would look at me and think, oh, well, you know, how do we make Ed comfortable? But if you make me sit under bright lights, you're not going to get much out of me.
Ed, I am convinced neuroinclusion is incredibly important for business. But where do I start? As a business, where do we begin? Because I've also heard you say one size does not fit all.
Yes, well, we've asked neurodivergent people the barriers that they face. And again, neurodiversity isn't simply about including neurodivergent people, but neurodivergent people experience the norms and the barriers in a sort of extreme way, if you like. So it's I think it's a pretty good place to start to understand what they're experiencing. And actually, it's also pretty proven that if you remove those barriers, it's good for everybody. And so being able, for example, to organize your work in the way that you like to is going to be beneficial for a so-called neurotypical generalist who might say, actually, that's great. That's helpful if you don't mind me if I do it like that. And it's might be mission critical for a neurodivergent person who says, if you don't let me do it like that, I'm stuck. But we've asked them, you know, what are the barriers you face? And the biggest barriers they describe are cultural. I mean, yes, they talk about physical environments. Yes, they talk about hiring processes. But the biggest issue is their teams just don't appreciate them, don't understand them, don't have sensitivity to the fact they might like to do things very differently. And often there is a reluctance to share, disclose because of stories of people who've done that and haven't had a positive result. You know, and we interviewed autistic women who said they disclosed and people said, oh, you can't possibly be autistic because you're female, you're married. You know, I had a friend who disclosed at work who's autistic, who was met with sympathy that this must mean he had a very short lifespan. Also nonsense. So, you know, we have to start with culture. We did some research last year with the CIPD in the UK, biggest HR professional body, I mean, one of the biggest in the world. And we found that even in the UK, where I think there's the best, most sort of lively conversation about this in the world, and it's not my bias, we found that more than a third of people at work didn't know what neurodiversity even was. And my guess is that's double that in the US. So the idea of that mindset, I can't remember which of your listeners talked about that sort of mindset shift. I mean, that's what we have to start with. And that's where, you know, some of the things we do, lunch and learns and you know, sort of foundational training to just get people to understand, well, what does this even mean? And why is it relevant to me? I know it doesn't sound sexy, but that is the platform that allows then more people to feel comfortable disclosing. As I said earlier, maybe more senior people start saying, actually, this is me as well. You start building this conversation. And that's when, and we have this verb, I mean, we're called optimize. We call it, our methodology sort of based on optimizing stuff, based on understanding neurodiversity, understanding how that plays out, and then understanding what we can do about it. You can start applying that model, and that's a model that we teach. You can start applying that model to how you run your meetings. We're about to run a strategy offsite, how you run something like that. Your learning and development is a big one as well, because most learning has never been delivered or built with different brains in mind. So you've got all these things that you can start getting stuck into. But to your point, Rob, about where do you start, you have to understand what it is. Why does it matter?
Excellent. And I think I heard you say that you actually have I'm going to use the wrong word now, a formula, a foundation for where organizations can begin.
Yeah, and it's really, and it kind of again goes back to the conversation Adam and I were having about sort of how do you approach this. I think I'll give you one of these the pieces of this. So if we accept that we are all working in neurodiverse contexts, maybe we hadn't had this awareness or really kind of lent into that enough. But we know everybody's different. We know lots of people who might qualify for a diagnosis as neurodivergent don't know it and haven't had access. Lots of people who understand themselves to be neurodivergent don't want to share. And again, we know everybody's different. How do we operate in that context? It's not about saying, okay, who's who, and then what do they need, right? It's actually about two things. And this is what we call the UP model. So part of our methodology is and the application of it is what we call the UP model. And the U is for universal design, and the P is for a person-centered approach. Universal design, which is a concept that's come from architecture, the idea of building homes, building office environments that work for everybody, we can apply in the workplace. And so we can start to think of what are all the things we can do, for example, in how we run our interviews that are more likely to work for different thinking styles, right? We're not waiting to say, oh, Ed, I had a traumatic brain injury. All right, you go sit over there, you get more time. We're just doing it anyway. And that's probably 90% of what we teach people. And then 10% of this is what we call the person-centered approach, which is where, and again, this goes back to what I was discussing with Adam. So universal design is going to be an enormous uplift, but you're going to get people who have very, very niche needs that maybe universal design doesn't cover. We were working with a police force, for example, and they had somebody as part of this initiative say, what I would like is a weighted blanket for while I'm in the police station. Now, of course, we hadn't thought of that. They hadn't thought of that. They didn't have 50 weighted blankets on the wall. But that was an opportunity for the person-centered approach. And this person knew how they work. They knew their sensory experience would be vastly improved by having this weighted blanket. So they didn't say, oh, no, we don't do that. They didn't say, we can't give you one unless we give one to everybody. They said, you know what you need. It's $100. Let's do it. And that person, started to be, again, more comfortable and more successful.
One more comment from the audience I want to share. Leif Sorensen says, why don't we use your model in a game to spread the word? He then goes on to ask the question that I ask all of our guests. Ed, this has been great. Where can people learn more? How can they get in touch with you?
Great. Again, thank you, everybody, and thanks. It's wonderful seeing such an engaged audience. I've been seeing everybody's comments and kind of nodding along and seeing so much knowledge and insight and enthusiasm here already. So thank you, everybody. I always like offering my own email, which is ed.thompson@uptimize.com. If anybody would like to talk to me directly, if they want to know more about us, uptimize.com. I and we are also on LinkedIn too, so give us a follow and vice versa.
Excellent, thank you. We now have a newsletter. Don't miss an episode. Get show highlights, beyond the show insights, and reminders of upcoming episodes. You can scan the QR code on screen or visit us at digitaldownload.live/newsletter. On behalf of our panelists, to our guest Ed, and to our very active audience, thank you all for being a part of today's